The heavy glass doors of the Gilded Lily swung open with a hush that felt more like a judgment than a welcome. Maya hesitated on the threshold, her fingers tightening around the small, beaded clutch she had borrowed for tonight. At 24, she had spent most of her life trying to blend into the beige walls of corporate offices and crowded subway cars, but tonight was different. Tonight, she was visible. The sleeveless red dress she wore was a striking departure from her usual oversized sweaters. The silk cascaded down her frame, catching the low, amber light of the restaurant's chandeliers against her deep, radiant skin. She felt beautiful, but she also felt terrifyingly exposed, like a raw nerve ending walking into a room full of scalpels. She checked her phone for the third time in 2 minutes. The text from Chloe was still the last thing on the screen. "He's waiting at table 14. Go get him, girl. You deserve this." Maya took a breath that rattled slightly in her chest and stepped inside. The maitre d' looked her over with a practiced, cool indifference before leading her through the labyrinth of velvet booths and white linen. The restaurant smelled of expensive truffle oil, aged leather, and old money. It was the kind of place where laughter was kept to a polite murmur and the clinking of silverware sounded like currency. As she walked, Maya felt eyes on her. Or perhaps it was just the phantom weight of her own insecurity. She didn't see the booth tucked away in the shadows near the bar, where 3 figures were huddled over a smartphone, stifling cruel giggles. Chloe, Brad, and Jessica were watching the live feed from a strategically placed phone propped against a napkin holder 2 tables away. They had pooled their money for the appetizers just to watch the show. To them, the red dress wasn't a statement of confidence. It was the punchline of a joke that had started weeks ago in the break room. They waited for the moment Maya would realize that table 14 was empty and that the handsome, wealthy suitor Chloe had invented didn't exist. When Maya reached the table, it was indeed empty. A reserved sign sat mockingly in the center of the pristine tablecloth. She sat down, smoothing the red silk over her legs, trying to maintain a posture of elegant expectancy. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. The waiter poured her water with a pitying tilt of his head that stung worse than a slap. Maya kept her gaze fixed on the entrance, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She took a sip of water, her hand trembling just enough to make the ice chime against the glass. In the corner booth, Chloe whispered to Brad, "Watch, she's going to check her makeup soon. She actually thinks he's coming." The cruelty was a cold, sharp thing, entirely invisible to Maya, who was currently fighting back the stinging prickle of tears. She felt the familiar, suffocating cloak of unworthiness descending on her shoulders. She had let herself believe, just for an evening, that she could be the protagonist of a romance rather than the background character in someone else's life. She looked down at her hands, the silence of the empty chair opposite her growing louder with every passing second. The atmosphere in the restaurant shifted imperceptibly, a change in air pressure that occurs when a predator enters a grazing field. The heavy doors opened again, but this time, the staff didn't look indifferent. They snapped to attention. The maitre d' straightened his spine so violently it looked painful. Walking through the entrance was a man who seemed to absorb the light around him. He was tall, wearing a charcoal suit cut so precisely it looked like a second skin, moving with a fluid, predatory grace that suggested coiled power. This was Junho. He wasn't a customer. He was the owner of the conglomerate that owned the building, the land, and arguably half the city block, though his name appeared on no menu. He rarely came down to the main floor, preferring the shadows of his penthouse office, but tonight, a restlessness he couldn't name had driven him downstairs. His sharp, dark eyes scanned the room, bypassing the nervous staff and the preening socialites until they landed on the anomaly in the center of the room.
He stopped.
The woman in the red dress was a splash of vibrant, desperate color in a sea of monochrome. Junho was a man who traded in secrets and observations. He could read a boardroom's fear in the twitch of a CEO's eye. What he saw in Maya wasn't just a woman waiting for a date. He saw the microscopic tremble of her lower lip, the way her fingers were white-knuckled around the stem of her water glass, and the rigid, brave posture of someone trying not to dissolve. He frowned, his gaze shifting slightly to the left, catching the reflection in the mirrored wall. He saw the trio in the corner booth, the suppressed laughter, the phone pointed in her direction, the hungry malice in their eyes. He knew exactly what was happening. It was a scene he had witnessed a dozen times in different forms, the weak feeding on the vulnerable to feel strong. A cold, dark anger sparked in his chest. It was a quiet fury, the kind that didn't shout but rather lowered the temperature of the room. Junho didn't check with the maitre d'. He didn't check the reservation list. He simply adjusted his cuffs and began to walk toward table 14. The staff froze. The floor manager looked as if he might faint.
Junho never mingled.
As he approached Maya's table, the air around her seemed to charge with static. She was looking down, blinking rapidly, when a shadow fell over her. She looked up, expecting the waiter to ask her to leave, or perhaps to deliver the final blow of the prank she hadn't yet figured out. Instead, she found herself looking up into a face that was devastatingly handsome and utterly unsmiling. He was terrifying, in the way a storm front is terrifying, yet his eyes, when they met hers, held no judgment. "I apologize for the delay," Junho said, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that carried just enough to be heard by the eavesdroppers in the corner. Traffic was unavoidable. Maya stared at him, her mouth opening slightly. I think you have the wrong," she started, her voice barely a whisper. Junho didn't let her finish. He pulled out the chair opposite her, the empty chair that had been mocking her, and sat down with an air of absolute finality. He looked at her, and for a split second, his expression softened, a micro-gesture meant only for her. "Play along," he murmured, so quietly the words were almost a breath. Then, louder, projecting authority, he signaled the waiter. "The tasting menu," and a bottle of the '98 vintage. Immediately, in the corner booth, the laughter had died instantly. Chloe's phone slipped in her hand. This wasn't the script. This wasn't the humiliating rejection they had engineered. The man sitting with Maya wasn't just a date. He was a titan, radiating a level of wealth and danger that made their corporate middle management existence look like child's play. Maya looked at Junho, confusion warring with relief. She didn't know who he was, but she knew that the suffocating feeling of being alone had just vanished. The arrival of the wine was a ceremony in itself. The sommelier's hands shook slightly as he presented the bottle to Junho, a reaction Maya found bewildering. She was still reeling, her mind trying to catch up with the sudden shift in reality. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered as the wine was poured, the rich red liquid swirling in the crystal. She felt like an imposter in her own life, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Junho rested his elbows on the table, clasping his hands. His focus was intense, excluding the rest of the room entirely. Because, he said, his tone devoid of the mockery she was used to hearing, grandeur requires an audience, and cruelty requires a victim. "I decided to deny them the latter," he nodded almost imperceptibly toward the corner booth. Maya didn't turn around. Something in his gaze anchored her, but she understood. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The text, the setup, the perfect guy, it was all a lie. Tears pricked her eyes again, but this time it wasn't from loneliness. It was from the sharp sting of humiliation. She started to reach for her clutch to leave, her instinct to flee taking over. "I should go," she stammered, shame heating her neck. I can't stay here if they're watching." Junho's hand moved across the table, not touching hers, but hovering close enough that she could feel the heat of his palm. It was a protective barrier. "If you leave now," he said, his voice calm and steady, "they win. They get the story of how you ran away. But if you stay," he paused, his dark eyes locking onto hers with a compelling intensity. "If you stay, you change the narrative. You become the woman who dined with the king, and they become the jesters who watched from the cheap seats." There was a challenge in his eyes, but also an invitation. He was offering her his status as a shield. Maya looked at the red dress she had spent weeks saving for. She looked at the man who had stepped out of the stratosphere to sit in an empty chair. Slowly, she released her grip on the clutch. She took a breath, channeling a courage she didn't know she possessed, and picked up her wine glass. "I don't know anything about wine," she admitted, her voice trembling but audible. A ghost of a smile touched the corner of Junho's mouth, the first true expression of warmth he had shown. "Then tonight," he said, raising his glass to hers, "you will learn." "We start with the nose." As they clinked glasses, the sound rang out clear and defiant, a bell signaling the start of a very different game. The dinner service began, and it was a masterclass in confidence. Junho did not dominate the conversation. He curated it. He asked her questions that mattered, about her art, which she had mentioned in passing, about what she observed in the city, about the things that made her quiet. He listened with a stillness that was unnerving at first, then deeply comforting. He spoke in Korean to the staff, brief, rapid-fire commands that resulted in dishes appearing as if by magic. Maya found herself relaxing, the knot of anxiety in her stomach loosening. She watched him strip the shell from a langoustine with surgical precision, placing the meat on her plate. It was a small, intimate act of service that felt louder than a shout. "You handle everything so precisely," she observed, watching his hands. "Control is a habit," he replied, wiping his fingers on a hot towel. "But chaos has its own beauty. That dress, for instance. It is chaotic in a room of gray. It is the only thing worth looking at tonight." Maya blushed, a deep warmth spreading through her chest. But the antagonists weren't done. From the corner of her eye, she saw a waiter approaching with a tray that held a single, garish cocktail, something neon blue with a sparkler in it, completely out of place in this fine dining establishment. It was a prank drink, likely ordered by Chloe to disrupt the tableau of elegance. The waiter looked terrified as he approached, caught between the customer's order and the owner's presence. He hesitated, holding the tray. Maya stiffened, recognizing the mockery. Junho didn't even turn his head. He simply lifted one hand, a single finger extended. The waiter froze instantly. Junho's eyes shifted to the man, cold and dead. "Remove it," he said. The volume was low, but the command was absolute. "And tell the table in the corner that their tab is closed. They are no longer welcome to order." The waiter practically ran backward. Maya watched the scene, her eyes wide. She realized then that Junho wasn't just a wealthy patron. He was the law in this room. The power he wielded was terrifying, yet he was using it to swat away flies that were bothering her. "You own this place," she stated. It wasn't a question. Junho turned back to her, the ice leaving his eyes instantly as he looked at her. "I own many things," he said simply, "but rarely do I enjoy them. Tonight is an exception." He poured more wine into her glass. "Do not let small people shrink your world, Maya. They are merely background noise. Focus on the melody." As the main course was cleared, Junho stood up and offered her his hand. "The air in here is stale. There is a terrace upstairs. It is private." It was a request, not a command, but the magnetic pull was undeniable. Maya placed her hand in his. His grip was firm, dry, and calloused, the hand of a man who had fought for his position. He led her past the stunned diners, past the frozen staff, and past the corner booth where Chloe, Brad, and Jessica sat in silent shock, their prank having backfired into a display of their own irrelevance. As they walked by, Junho didn't even look at them. That was the ultimate insult. They were beneath his notice. But Maya looked. She met Chloe's gaze and saw the envy there, naked and ugly. Maya didn't smirk. She just lifted her chin slightly, the red silk flowing around her like royal robes, and kept walking. The terrace was a sanctuary of cool night air and city lights. They stood by the stone railing, looking out over the skyline. The noise of the restaurant was gone, replaced by the distant hum of traffic and the rustle of ornamental bamboo. Maya shivered slightly, the adrenaline fading to leave a vulnerable exhaustion. Without a word, Junho removed his suit jacket and draped it over her shoulders. It was heavy, warm, and smelled of cedar and rain. "Thank you," she whispered, pulling the lapels tighter. "For everything. You didn't have to save me." She turned to face him, searching his face in the moonlight. "Why did you? Really? Junho leaned against the railing, looking at her with a seriousness that made her breath hitch. "Because I know what it is to be watched," he said, his voice dropping to a lower, rougher register. "To be judged by people who do not know the weight you carry." He reached out, his fingers grazing a loose curl near her temple, tucking it behind her ear. The touch was electric. "You wear your heart like armor, Maya. But tonight I saw the cracks. And I wanted to stand between you and the blow." Maya felt a tear finally escape, tracing a hot path down her cheek. "I thought I was unlovable," she confessed, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I thought. That's why they picked me. Because no one would ever really come." Junho stepped closer, invading her personal space in the most gentle way possible. "Then they are blind," he said. "Because I am here. And I am not leaving." The valet brought the car around, a sleek, black sedan that looked more like a weapon than a vehicle, its engine purring with a low, menacing thrum. Junho guided her into the passenger seat with a hand on the small of her back, a touch that was possessive yet incredibly gentle. As he slid into the driver's seat, the silence of the car enveloped them, sealing out the noise of the city and the lingering humiliation of the restaurant. Maya looked out the window as the streetlights blurred into streaks of amber and white. She was still wearing his suit jacket. It engulfed her frame, a heavy, comforting shell that smelled of expensive cologne and tobacco smoke. "Where are we going?" she asked softly, realizing she hadn't even thought to ask before getting in. Junho didn't look away from the road, his profile cut sharp against the passing lights. "My driver usually handles the evenings," he said, his voice dropping the formal edge it had held in the restaurant. "But I need to get away from the city center. I cannot take you home yet, Maya." He paused, his grip tightening slightly on the steering wheel. "The evening has been intense. For both of us. My home is nearby, up in the hills. It is quiet there. I would like to offer you a moment of actual peace before you return to reality. Do you mind a detour?" There was a vulnerability in the request, a crack in the monolith. He wasn't demanding her time. He was admitting he needed an escape, and he wanted her there with him. Maya turned to look at him fully. "I don't have anywhere I need to be," she admitted, the truth of her lonely life stinging less now that she was sitting beside him. "Is everything okay?"
Junho exhaled slowly.
"My life is complicated. There are parts of it that require constant vigilance. But tonight, I am tired of vigilance." He glanced at her, his eyes dark and unreadable. "You asked why I saved you. The truth is, I didn't just save you. I saw someone who was holding her ground in a war zone, without a weapon. I respect that. If you wish to be dropped off at a subway station, tell me now." The offer was genuine, but the tension in his jaw suggested he desperately wanted her to stay. Maya pulled his jacket tighter around herself. She thought of her empty apartment, the silence that waited for her. "I'm not afraid," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. "Drive." The car accelerated smoothly, merging onto the highway that led away from the city center and toward the secluded hills where the estates sat behind high iron gates. The drive was quiet, but it wasn't empty. Every time Junho shifted gears, his hand brushed near her knee, sending a jolt of awareness through her. He played a piece of classical music, something melancholic and cello-heavy, which seemed to strip away the remaining adrenaline of the confrontation, leaving them both in a state of raw, quiet intimacy. Maya watched him drive, the competence, the focus. It was a reminder of who he was. He wasn't just a CEO, he was a man who lived with targets on his back. And yet, inside this steel cocoon, she felt safer than she ever had in the bright, exposed fluorescent lights of her office. The car came to a halt in front of a sprawling, modern structure of glass and concrete that jutted out over the cliffside like a fortress. It was beautiful but imposing, lacking the warmth of a home. Security guards stepped out of the shadows, their hands resting near their waists, but they relaxed instantly when they saw Junho. He came around to open her door, offering his hand again. The air up here was thinner, colder. As they walked toward the massive front door, Maya felt a tremor of nervousness. The heavy door scanned Junho's biometrics and slid open silently. The interior was vast, minimalist, and shadowed, decorated in shades of slate and charcoal. It felt like a museum, untouched and unlived in. The silence was absolute, pressing against her ears. Junho walked to the center of the living room and stopped. He didn't turn on the lights, leaving them bathed in the blue-gray glow of the moonlight filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. He let out a long, shuddering breath, his shoulders dropping as if he had just set down a physical weight. He walked over to a wet bar in the corner, pouring a glass of amber liquid. His hand shook, just once, before he steadied it. Maya watched him, realizing that the king was just a man who was incredibly lonely. She walked further into the room, her heels clicking on the stone. "It's very
Quiet," she said softly.
Junho took a sip of his drink and turned to face her, leaning back against the counter. "It is safe," he corrected. "I built this place to be a fortress. Nothing gets in. No noise, no threats." He gestured vaguely around the cold, beautiful room. "But the problem with a fortress is that once the gate is closed, you are trapped inside." He looked at her, his eyes stripping away the layers of his persona. "I have a sister. She passed 2 years ago."
Rival factions.
It was not an accident. The confession hung in the air, heavy and dark. "Since then, I have removed everything soft from my life. I thought it was the only way to survive." Maya walked over to him. She didn't touch him, but she stood close enough to share his warmth. "You were soft tonight," she countered gently. "You saw me when no one else did. That's not power, Junho. That's heart." She looked around the immaculate, sterile room. "You don't have to live in a museum just to be safe. You can let the light in." Junho looked at her, his dark eyes searching her face. "I've spent my life building walls," he murmured, stepping closer, his voice dropping to a rough whisper. "And you? You walked through them in one night without even trying." The air between them crackled. He reached out, his hand hovering over her cheek, trembling slightly. "I am dangerous, Maya. My world is not a fairy tale. Being near me, it has consequences." "I've lived a safe life," Maya replied, leaning almost imperceptibly into his hand. "I've been safe and invisible and miserable. I don't want safe anymore. I want real." It was the bravest thing she had ever said. Junho's thumb brushed her cheekbone, a feather-light touch that sent shivers down her spine. "Then come," he said, his voice thickening with emotion. "I cannot offer you a normal date, but I can offer you
Dinner.
real dinner." He gestured toward the kitchen, a faint, boyish smirk touching his lips. "I believe the tasting menu was interrupted. And I make excellent ramyun." The tension broke, replaced by a warm, bubbling laughter from Maya. The absurdity of it, the Mafia boss, the red dress, the emotional confession, and now instant noodles, felt perfect. The kitchen was a marvel of stainless steel and marble, clearly designed for a catering staff rather than a single man, but tonight it felt intimate. Junho took off his suit jacket, rolling up the sleeves of his white dress shirt to reveal forearms corded with muscle and marked by a faint scar or two. He moved around the kitchen with the same efficiency he applied to everything, but there was a clumsiness to his domesticity that Maya found endearing. He couldn't find the small bowls. He almost dropped the eggshells into the broth. It humanized him. Maya, still in her silk gown, finally kicked off her heels and padded across the cold floor barefoot. "Move over," she teased gently, nudging him with her hip. "You're going to overcook the noodles." She took the chopsticks from his hand, their fingers brushing and lingering for a second too long. They ate sitting on the kitchen island, shoulder to shoulder. The steam from the spicy broth curled between them, smelling of chili and comfort. It was infinitely better than the truffle oil and pretension of the gilded lily. "So," Junho said, slurping the noodles with an unself-conscious noise that made Maya smile. "Tell me about the art. The one you mentioned before the waiter interrupted us." Maya paused, her chopsticks halfway to her mouth. "No one ever asked about her sketches." "It's nothing really. Just charcoal.
I draw. People on the subway.
People who look like they're waiting for something that isn't coming." She looked down at her bowl. "I guess I was drawing myself."
Junho stopped eating.
He turned his stool to face her fully.
"And tonight?"
If you were to draw tonight? Maya looked at him, the sharp angles of his face softened by the kitchen track lighting, the intense focus in his eyes. I draw a door, she whispered. Opening. The metaphor landed softly between them. Junho reached out and took her hand, his thumb tracing the knuckles. I want to be that door, he said, the intensity returning to his voice. I have been closed for a long time, Maya. But with you. I feel a draft, he chuckled darkly at his own joke, and Maya laughed with him. It was a shared language of lonely people finding a dialect they both understood. Suddenly, a phone buzzed on the counter. It was harsh, intrusive.
Junho's face hardened instantly.
He picked it up, read the message, and the vulnerable man vanished, replaced by the boss. His eyes went cold. What is it? Maya asked, fear creeping back in. Your friends, he said, the word dripping with venom. They posted the video. The one they took before I arrived. They are mocking you online. It is gaining traction. Maya felt the blood drain from her face. The nightmare wasn't over. The internet was laughing at her. She slid off the stool, panic rising. I have to go. I have to. Junho didn't move to stop her physically, but his voice stopped her dead. It is already handled. Maya turned, confused. What? Junho tapped the screen once, then set the phone down face down. I own the platform's parent company's regional server rights. The video is deleted. The accounts are suspended. And, he paused, his voice taking on a terrifyingly calm cadence, I have forwarded the footage of their prank, including the illegal recording in a private establishment, to their employers. They've violated the privacy policy of the Gilded Lily. They will be terminated by morning. He looked at Maya, his expression softening again. I told you. I do not let people hurt what is mine. The possessiveness of the word mine hung in the air. He wasn't asking for permission to protect her. He was stating it as a fact of nature. Maya stared at him. It was extreme. It was ruthless. It was exactly what she had needed someone to do for her whole life. She walked back to him, stepping into his personal space, her hands trembling as she placed them on his chest, feeling the steady, powerful beat of his heart. You didn't have to destroy them, she whispered, though a part of her was savagely glad he had. I didn't do it for revenge, Junho said, covering her hands with his. I did it to clear the noise. So that the only thing you hear is this. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. You are not a joke, Maya. You are the punchline to a life I didn't know I was missing. The kiss, when it came, was slow, tasting of spicy broth and salvation. It wasn't the desperate kiss of a movie climax. It was the steady, grounding seal of a promise kept. 6 months later. The morning light filtered through the sheer curtains of the penthouse, but the room didn't look like a museum anymore. A cashmere throw blanket was draped over the austere gray sofa. A pair of fuzzy slippers sat next to the Italian leather shoes by the door. Maya sat at the kitchen island, sketching on a tablet, wearing one of Junho's oversized shirts. She looked up as the elevator dinged. Junho walked in, looking tired from a night of business, but his eyes lit up when he saw her. He didn't go to his office. He went straight to her, wrapping his arms around her waist from behind, burying his face in her neck. You're home early, she murmured, leaning back into him. I missed the peace, he replied, his voice muffled against her skin. He glanced over her shoulder at the tablet. It was a sketch of him, not the scary CEO in the suit, but the man in the kitchen with rolled-up sleeves, cooking noodles. He smiled, a genuine, easy expression that reached his eyes. You captured my good side. Maya turned in his arms, smoothing the lapel of his jacket. She was no longer the girl who hid in beige sweaters. She was the woman who had turned a fortress into a home. I have a date tonight, she teased. Oh. Junho raised an eyebrow, a playful glint in his eyes. With who? With a very dangerous man, she smiled, tapping his nose. He promised to take me to a street food stall he used to love before he became a king. Junho kissed her forehead, a gesture of infinite tenderness. Then, he is a lucky man, he whispered, because he gets to be seen by you. Outside, the city continued its chaotic grind. The 3 antagonists, Chloe, Brad, and Jessica, were distant memories, scattered to lower-paying jobs in different cities, their cruelty having cost them everything. But high above the noise, in a glass fortress turned sanctuary, two people stood together in the morning light. They had been broken in different ways, one by loneliness, one by loss, but together they had built a mosaic that was stronger than the original pieces. Junho held her close, his hand resting on the small of her back. He had stopped clenching his fists. He had finally found something worth holding on to that didn't require force. He had found home,